Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Learn with Jason. So today we're specifically talking about story to design, right?
Yes.
And so maybe we can talk just really quickly as I'm looking at the homepage here. Let's give a high-level overview of specifically what story to design is doing.
Story.to.design is a team effort for quite some time, actually, within Div Riots. We did see this need to bring code back to design. So we don't intend to get in the way of that process, which is common in design system teams, in which the designer defines how the component looks like.
Okay.
So we still think that that might be the case sometimes, right? You came across a need of a component, you want to style it, you go ahead, you make the definitions, but then you have to hand that over to your developer, and then your developer will code it, and that's what we consider the source of truth. Because no matter how much you define the style of the component, you will actually, what gets to the product is what ended up being developed. So with Story.to.design plugin, we want to bring that developed back to Figma.
Right.
And in the future, possibly other applications as well. So yeah, that's how it works. Very easy. We are going to install the plugin. We're going to link your Storybook stories, and we're going to start generating variants. So by bringing it back from code, we intend to now make this link between code and design. So when there is any change in the code, your designs can get updated. So you can continue working with your library because basically the link is there.
Great. So I'm in the Figma plugin directory here, and I've just installed story to design. And now, where
We're going to
should
start a new file.
I can start a new file? All right, so a new design
Yeah.
file.
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
So in this scenario, let's say you are the designer and your team has already set up a storybook stories for your component library. Now everything is coded and it's documented. Similar to Storybook, we have Backlight. Backlight, like what we mentioned before, being the full-on design system platform. It also handles the stories, so the CSF format that Storybook also handles. So all that very basically is what is needed for the plugin to start making variants from the code. In the scenario that we're in, you're the designer, and let's say you work with Audi. So actually, if you go to storybook.js, if I'm not mistaken, you go to Showcase.
Showcase.
Yes, so we have view all storybooks. The
Oh, here it is
UI
right up top.
React Audi. Yes, there we go.
So then we can kind of look in here
So
and see,
exactly.
let's look at a button.
Yes,
Go to the
buttons are the best
overview.
component examples.
So here's a
Yeah.
primary button, a secondary button, a text only button. We can go to
Yep.
variations and see different
You
sizes,
have different sizes.
states.
Yep.
Okay.
You can check the checkbox, for example.
Yeah, so we got
Yeah.
here's this, and if we go into variations, we can see
Yeah.
the idle, disabled, read only, error,
Yeah.
different options and stuff. So yeah, these are all things that I would expect from a design system. And this is what people like about Storybook is I can go in and see very, very quickly what's available to me, right?
You can imagine now yourself as a designer. You have this beautiful library that all the developers have access to. They can copy that little piece of code and start using it straight away. But now you want to have the same thing in Figma so you can start designing it away. Luckily, now we have Story.to.design as a savior for our situation. So if you go
Okay,
back to
I'm
your file,
back to my file.
let's open Story.to.design plugin. So to open
Plugins
plugin, yeah, there
here.
you go.
In my best hacker voice, I'm in. Here's my react.ui.audi because it's asking me for a storybook URL. And so I just,
Correct.
boom.
Yep.
Good.
And press enter. Connect. So as you could see in the previous screen, we have support for both Storybook and Backlight. So now one thing that is nice to see, under the components, like you can expand that, Everything that you see here is what you see inside that Storybook link that we were at. Right now, you are in a section called Explore Stories. So
Okay.
let me walk you through these two parts of the UI. Right above, we have components with a big blue button called Import New Components. So that's the one for actually generating the useful variants components that we are going to use in our final designs. So over here, if you want to go ahead, let's just create a button that we saw in the Storybook. What we need to do is define the different arcs that make up that button. So for those who are familiar with Figma, they know you can create one component with several variants, right? And normally it's done for the different styles, like the size of the button, the type, like primary, secondary typography, or for the different what else, like success, warning. So there are many ways to think about a button and how to organize this matrix. And what the plugin is going to do for you is actually going to define all that for the selection that we get in the Storybook stories. And
okay, so I want the size, and now like we've got 24 variants there, and I probably want this variant. Okay, that's 72.
We selected also the disabled. It's an interesting one. Icon and loading, for now, we can unselect those. But
That's
the
12.
hover state, I think it might be interesting. And the focus state, maybe. Let's see.
Okay, 36. That seems like a reasonable number.
Yeah, it's pretty easy. Go ahead and click Import Component. So as the plugin is doing its magic in the background, it actually doesn't stop us from making selections on the following components that we want to import. Because in the end, our goal is to set up an entire library, not just buttons. So you can click that button again and go on the top. Let's select now the next one. Maybe a badge. Let's make up some badges. Let's select the stories. So for the badge, the sizing is not interesting, but variant for sure. And badge is a component that doesn't normally have an interaction, so the hover state, focus state doesn't really, it's not really interesting. So let's just import 4.
Okay.
Let's go for the next one. Maybe let's go to, let's make the checkbox. Yep. And select some arguments. Let's go for checked, for disabled, for invalid. I think that's more like a technical one that visually is not going to really show you anything, if I remember correctly. So this is an interesting part, right? As a designer and a developer, and I'm going through this plugin, it doesn't mean that I'm not going to talk to the developer. I still need to understand their reasoning and what are the definitions that they defined in the component, and is that relevant for my visual design or not? And for the checkbox, is interesting to see the focus state. Yeah, so I would import those.
Okay.
So as you could see, the buttons are ready. Let's go ahead and create them.
Wow. Okay. And badge.
Boom. Badge, it's created, and
checkbox
created.
Okay.
You can close the plugin.
I'm coming out here. I want to look. Okay. So based on this, and I need to change the background color. Let's see.
It's on your right over there on your panel.
Oh, background. Here we go. Yeah, let's make this a little bit.
Because you have Figma on the dark mode.
Right. So we've got now each of these show. Oh, okay. So it tells us all of the components. So text, disabled, whatever. This is all good. All right. Yep. So now I can kind of see, like, here's my disabled states, and this looks like a hover state. This is maybe an active state, or focus state. Okay. Come over here. Here are badges, and then we have.
I would have to see what.
Checkboxes. So this looks like standard. This looks like.
That's the focus one, probably.
Focus mode, disabled. Cool.
Yep.
All right.
So the way Figma works is these are like the raw version of the component where a design system person or the maintainer of this library will be working around here. But for the designers in the the rest of the teams, the product designers, what they are really interested in is the assets tab that you have there in your left panel. So when you go next to layers assets and you open up components, so these are the components for them. So hover
Oh,
on the button.
interesting.
If you hover on the button one, you, you see there's also a description there. This description came from the Storybook. So that's something that the plugin does for us as well. Yes, that description. So if the Storybook is
Cool.
set with the description, the plugin will import like the visual representation of that button, but also any other relevant information that
Hmm.
we can make use of in Figma. So for documentation purposes, this is great because now you also have no diversion of what is being documented for developers and what's being documented for designers. Everybody's talking the same language. So to use this component, actually, you can just drag it into the empty space in your there. So this is actually just the component that a designer would go ahead and make their UI. So you can select your variant from text. You can select the primary, secondary.
Oh, look at this, y'all. Okay, so this was already cool because I was like, oh yeah, I can just grab the one that I need. But so here, I can just work on. Oh, let's disable it. Nope, that's fine. Okay, let's make the medium one. All right, that's good. I want it to be focused. Okay, there's my focus outline, and it's easier to see with the secondary. So if we go here and then we do the focus outline, right?
Yep.
And then we can do a hover.
Yep.
I don't know what the hover does. It like
I
gets a
think it
little bit
changes the
lighter.
color a little bit.
I get
Yeah.
it.
But
Okay.
also, just go to the component on the Storybook itself. You will see that it's exactly the same. So now don't judge
Cool.
how this focus state or this hover state looks like, because if you don't think it's great, well, that was the design the system team definition, right? So maybe they need to change it. It's not a plugin.
Right.
There is one more thing that is really cool about buttons specifically. So one of the great features from Figma is the fact that you can build these components in a very usable way. So now, if you double click where it's written button action, and you just change that, you see how the button is like growing with it?
Yep.
So that's, I mean, it's a bit of a normal thing for anybody used to Figma right now, but for those who started with design systems before
Right.
the auto layout option, this is kind of awesome. So
Yeah.
these buttons made by the plugin are already coming with auto layout.
Extremely cool. So I mean, this is this is kind of what I've always dreamed of when I'm working with these sorts of systems, is that like I always have these high hopes of creating a design system, and then I start designing in the browser with like code, and then it drifts, and then I'm like, I'm not going to go back and update all that. And so this is pretty interesting that what we're seeing is like, if I want to build out a quick prototype, I can just grab these things and say like, all right, I'm going to, build out a quick thing of saying like, okay, we've got option 1, right? Oops. And then we've got
Yep.
option 2. All right.
Yep.
Now I want this one to be checked, so I'm going to check the box. And
Yep.
like, this is just extremely cool that we're able to put all of this together so quickly.
It's great to be able to import these components, but what if something changes?
Mm-hmm.
So right now, what I'm going to describe to you is the change coming from code. I see in the chat that there are some questions about the designer wanting to change, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. For example, so you open the plugin again. There you go. There is a 3 dots over there, exactly. So if, let's say, your developer colleague in Audi design system decided, or well, the whole team decided that your buttons are no longer square, they're going to be rounded, they can easily update the code. For them, it's usually like often cases some of the style changes for the components is really just one line of code. For
Mm-hmm.
designer, you could picture it would be like 36 little squares that you'd have to update back in the old days. But now with Story.to.design, when that change happens in code, we can come back here, click update, and boom, we would get that update. So,
and when we do that update, because this is set up as a component, and because these are built from that component, we'll update all of this and every usage of it.
Yep,
So, and
correct.
what's interesting about that is this might be the first tool that I've seen that aligns incentives around this, because like when I was working with other design systems, because there was no like automatic update, there was not really a high penalty for just, I'll just make a copy of this and change it to fit my design. And now it's no longer linked to the component. It's all kind of like, well, whatever. But nobody cared because there wasn't a central component. There wasn't anything. But with this, now the incentive is don't break the components because you'll lose your automatic updates.
Yep, that's
That's a
exactly right.
cool incentive.
So actually, if, for example, in this button that you inserted, so that's an instance of the button, right? The one that
Mm-hmm.
is click to boop. Um, you could here hard code a radius. So on your right panel, there is a little radius symbol. So let's say you put 30 or whatever value there. So what you're doing is you're just overriding a instance of a component inside
Mm-hmm.
Figma. This component is still somewhat connected to that component above, right? So that group that we see around the dotted purple square, that's still like the same component. But because you overrode that radius, you now sort of lost this connection. So whatever happens to the radius of the original component, what persists is your override, but that's a feature from Figma. Figma
Mm-hmm.
understands that, hey, if you needed to override this in this instance, you probably needed it. So, but to your point on like the incentive to not having to override anything, that's exactly right. So now if designers are making these forced changes in their Figma file, their Figma instances, that means something needs to change at the essence of it. And if it needs to change for them, it probably needs to change for everybody. Hence,
Mm-hmm.
you should probably do it in the code anyway. To answer the questions in the chat, right now there is not a way for a designer to make a change to the variant. So we would suggest that in a process of like, oh, hey, the designer wants to change something in the component, circle back with the developers. Like find your process in which how do you make suggestions for changes? How do you experiment with these suggestions? And then once it's been approved, branched, merged, like everything tested, then you can receive your update back again in your official Figma library, which is this one generated by the plugin.
To say that another way to make sure that I'm understanding, the recommendation here is, because the code is the source of truth, changes don't get made in Figma, changes get made in code.
Right. And our path right now is the source lives in the code, we bring it back to Figma. Hence, one way street for now.
Mm-hmm.
One additional benefit from using a library that is generated by the plugin is the terminology and the naming conventions. Now it's all one. You're inheriting that structure that the developer defined, the grouping, they call it components, and then they go into buttons and all that naming convention gets now pushed to Figma. So everybody's talking about the same thing.
I mean, that's a great point. Like I've spent a huge amount of time in meetings where we were arguing about something, and at the end of it, what we realized is that we were talking about exactly the same thing, but we used different words for what that thing was. And so what this is doing is actually interesting, where in the context of a design system, through the collaborative process of building it, you're forcing shared vocabulary, like you said. And now you can't have that disconnect where like the executive is saying, do the balloon bubble, and the designer's like, oh, I know what that is, that's a pop out. And
That's a popover.
the developer, yeah, the developer's like, well, wait, hold on, but we only have the fly out, and they're all talking about exactly the same thing. And
Exactly. So there is also another feature from the plugin. So if you go back to your Figma file, we have that second step underneath the explore stories, right?
Mhm.
So when you hit play button, and you can do it to all of them at the same time, this is just the plugin processing the information behind. When you do it to the buttons, for example,
Looked for the
what
buttons.
the plugin is gonna do is it's gonna calculate all the stories that um, is inside that storybook link, and it will eventually outline it for us as a documentation piece. So I really like this feature on the Explore stories as a process to maybe even validate that what got developed matches what I intended and what
Mm,
are the different variants that I have um, available for me to make a component of. So hopefully this is not, yeah, there you go. We can check the avatar. Click
okay,
import all
should
stories.
just import.
Yeah. So this is basically bringing in the stories from Storybook, but they are like layouted in as a documentation piece. Each
Mm,
one of them has the link. So as a designer, I can come back here and see, oh, look, the avatars that the developers have access to is the large RTL, the medium, the small. So it's useful for me to have those components accessible for me to make designs, but it's also useful for me to know what is out there in
mm-hmm.
one view.
And this is really cool. And then I saw another thing that I just want to highlight here, which is that if I click on this and then scroll down, the plugin actually gives me the ability to like jump to the story,
Yep.
which is really cool. And it drops me right into not just like what I did, but it like pops into it like added all the properties. So if we set these up, like that's really cool that all works.
That's correct. So for the developer, this is great, right? Because now they know exactly which definitions in their code they need to come up with in order to build up that design. So in when you go back to Figma, Figma also has this inspect feature.
Where was I? Here.
Yeah. So for example, now you finished your product design and you hand it over to the developers. They will look at the design, probably through on the right panel, the inspect tab. And in there, down there, you see, because you have the button selected, there is a link to view documentation as well.
Oh, cool.
So that's the same thing as you saw previously. It's just here is the environment in which probably the developer would be more familiar with,
Well, and
achieve
check this
this
out too, because
exact
it
look.
shows that, we have the, like, which variant are we using? Is it disabled? What size is it? So we're actually able to do all of these other pieces as well, which is really interesting.
This is about the designer and the developer working more together to make the component work for both worlds.
So what I like about what we're doing here is that I could start by saying, can we just agree on what a button looks like? Like that's all. That's all I want is for us to agree on what a button looks like. And we say yes, we put it in Storybook, and then we import it into Figma. And now the designers and the developers have all agreed we will always use this component. And then over time, as things emerge and as we start to see more patterns, we can just add a couple more components. And every time we do that, now we can import that into Figma and we get, a predictable design, predictable code. And whenever we find something that doesn't meet our needs, we can go in and just add a variant, add a setting, whatever it is, to give us the flexibility to accomplish that. But it's always syncing.
Additionally, I would say also there is the reality in which you as a designer is starting a team that already has something going on. Like that was the case for me actually with Div Riots. They have been working on design systems. We have our own design system way before I started. And now I wanted to jump in and get going with making UI improvements to our
Mm,
product. But I had to define all those components in Figma again. And like how many libraries have I built so far,
right.
It's always the same process. Only if could I inherit something that is already in code in Figma. Well, luckily now we have a plugin, but I think yeah, the reality for those like say freelancers that are joining a new team that already has a storybook set up and they can just kickstart the entire design process because they have at ease access a full
Mm,
library exactly at their brands, right? And also there is the option in which, like you said, the developer can go ahead, like they've seen a component that has been used in the product, they already developed, they can include it in the design system. The designer is busy with other jobs, and now, hey, there is a new component free for you available very quickly, and you don't
mm-hmm,
have to try to do it and try to keep up with what the developers are doing, what the designers are doing. Like everybody can like start walking at the same pace, or at
mm-hmm.
least pretty close at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's all like looking at this, I can feel, there, every team is going to have to work out their specific communication style and make sure that they can agree on the way things go. But this feels like a good tool for facilitating that conversation. And especially, as I mentioned, as you mentioned, the worlds are growing together. Designers and developers are not discrete entities that don't speak anymore. It's now very much an overlapping Venn diagram where you need design at every stage of the development process, and you need developers to weigh in really early in the design process, because everything that's happening, they all have dependencies, right? If we're designing for the web has support, and developers need to give a heads up that, like, hey, you're doing something that's going to be really, really hard to develop, and designers need to be paying attention all the way through implementation to say, hey, that doesn't feel as good as we thought it would. Like,
Yeah.
let's revisit that interaction. So, Tice, this is so much good information. So many good things are happening. Where should people go if they want to learn more about this? So I'm gonna do the obvious thing and throw people to Story.to.design.
Yeah,
Are there any
that's a
other
great place.
resources or articles or
Yeah.
things that you want people to
S
review?
No, definitely. We have Backlight.dev as the main product that we at DevRads work with. And Backlight website is also a great resource for articles around design systems. So when you go to resources, you will see,
Resources. Here we go. If
yeah,
I can
there is
click
a
the
blog
button.
space. And over there, we try to keep up and publishing like all the knowledge that we have around, workflows and processes and tools, other design systems for inspirations. We also have within Backlight the section Mastery, that we want to make the ultimate university around design system, where people can really know all the details that it takes to make a good design system, to document it, to build your design kits. So yeah, Story.to.design. To find out more about the plugin, you will follow the link, and you will, once you install the plugin, you can sign up for the demo we'll give you, and see if the private beta is an interesting step for you. We also will release this plugin publicly later this year. So keep an eye on that. We'll be announcing it on Twitter. Or if you want, we also have a Discord channel. There's so many channels to join, actually. But everything is connected. You will find information in the Backlight website here. The plugin, as we went through it in the demo, it works with Storybook, and it also works with Backlight. I think, of course, because this is a short-ish episode, we cannot explore all the different possibilities in
Mm-hmm.
one go. But it's also really fun to see it work with Backlight, and to see different workflows around yeah, how to set up this steps, processes around designers, developers, from code to design, from design to code. I think there's
Mm-hmm.
just so many scenarios to walk through in when building a design system.
So, okay. So with that, I think we're going to call this one a glowing success. Even with a Figma incident, we were still able to get this all set up, get our design system imported. And I just want to just very quickly reiterate that this is extraordinarily cool how quickly we were able to jump in here and build out a really functional library so that we could build this tiny little form UI. I didn't have to design a dang thing. I just dragged stuff out from my assets and built out this little form, right?
Yep.
So this is really powerful stuff, and something that I encourage everybody to definitely go in and try. Um,
You know what I'm gonna do? I
yeah,
have the Audi design system that I generated from Story.to.design. I will publish it in the Figma community as a file. I'll publish it in Twitter, so for those people following, or they will be able to find it out, and you can play with these components yourself. So
mm-hmm.
you won't be able to play with the plugin yet unless you take part on our beta, but at least you get to see what got generated by the plugin. Really fun stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that is some very, very cool stuff. Make sure you get on that wait list for for Story to Design so that you get access to it as soon as it becomes available to everyone. Thijs, thank you so much for taking some time to teach us today. It was super, super fun. Chat, as always, thank you. Stay tuned for the raid. We will see you all next time.
Thanks, everybody.